Okay, welcome back to another video. I hope everyone is doing well. It's a busy Friday afternoon here. Sorry for some background noise. There's construction going on beside me, but it's going to be a fairly unique video. It's not about cryptocurrency or really Arduinos, but it's more about my Raspberry Pi. Because a few days ago, I couldn't connect to my Raspberry Pi via VNC Connect, VNC Viewer. And I thought that maybe I just had to turn it on and turn it off again, but even after doing that, I still could not connect to the Raspberry Pi. And everything externally, how it looks right now, all the hardware was fine. There was no magic smoke, there was no burnt components, or nothing looked off. So I started to troubleshoot my Raspberry Pi. The LEDs were a bit questionable because I saw that there are two LEDs here. There's a green LED and a red LED. The red LED indicates whether the Raspberry Pi is receiving enough power, and the green LED represents if a program is running, the operating system, for example, or any program which you have uploaded to the Raspberry Pi. I realized that the red LED was turned off, but the green LED was blinking. And it wasn't blinking consistently, it was sort of in a random pattern. So that was one of the first indications I had that something may be going off. And as a lot of people do, this first step in troubleshooting, I tried to reflash the SD card. There is a micro SD card over here, right over here, and it's basically contains the package for the operating system. It's right now it's the Raspberry Pi 32-bit operating system that I have uploaded on here. And as you can see, this is just a usual, a normal Raspberry Pi, nothing too fancy. It's the Raspberry Pi 3 Model B, and I've had it for quite a while now, many years. And this is just a dual fan for cooling, plugged into the power as on one of the pins, and there's just a heat sink at the back, a ceramic heat sink for the chip on the back. So nothing fancy, no really major upgrades going on, just a standard Raspberry Pi. And so from there, I reflashed the SD card, yet it still did not connect. It still did not turn on, and I tried plugging in a monitor via the micro HDMI port, but nothing seemed to have worked. The monitor was black the whole time, no programs was booting up, the operating system did not boot up. So from there, I really didn't know what to do, so I decided to check on the power supply. This is the power supply that I previously had, and this has lasted me for many years now. I got it when I bought this Pi. As you can see, it's 5 volt, and it's a 5 volt output and 2.5 amps for the current. And I actually tried changing power supplies. I instead used a normal phone charger. This is just an Apple charger, nothing too fancy. Oh, it says it's a 12 watt USB power adapter, 5 volts, and 5.2 volts output and 2.4 amps. 2.4 amps as the current rating. Sorry about that. Let me just focus in so you can read the specifications. So that is just the phone charger, and I changed it to the phone charger. I once again powered it via the micro USB port here, and it worked. And the screen, the screen which I got plugged in, it booted up with the normal operating system. And I was surprised. I thought I had found the solution, which I actually did. It's this power supply, which I didn't really suspect to be broken, because it was just running quietly with no issues for many years now. And it has supported me and has powered this Raspberry Pi with no problems. So after I powered it on with the phone charger, there was still a low power alert. However, I checked the LEDs and both were running fine. The red LED was turned on and the green LED was flashing. So those were good indications that the Raspberry Pi is receiving enough power and that the program is running smoothly. So the problem was simply that the power supply was faulty and it was not supplying enough voltage. However, because this is a phone charger, it does have current limiting it basically limits the current, so it doesn't really supply enough current, enough power for the Raspberry Pi to run smoothly. So I'm in the process of purchasing a new power supply for the Raspberry Pi that I can use instead of my phone charger. However, on top of that, I also did further testing with the Raspberry Pi in order to see how much power the Raspberry Pi is receiving when it is powered via the phone charger, via the original power supply compared to the phone charger. So I used a very standard multimeter. This is it's a Zotac multimeter I got a few years ago. It's a really standard multimeter. It measures AC, DC voltage, resistance, continuity, frequency, etc. So this is just I guess it's a bit on the higher end in terms of multimeters. It's not the most basic, but it does the job very well, and I've had it for several years now. So I turned it on, I switched it to DC voltage mode in order to measure the DC voltage which is being supplied to the Raspberry Pi, of course, and no probes are plugged in right now. And I had to use an online guide, an online reference, in order to measure the, sorry about the camera movement, the DC voltage. As you can see, there are multiple test points as indicated by the markings, starting with a P and a P. So I actually had to connect the multimeter probe. The ground probe went to, I believe it was PP5, and to measure the input voltage, I connected it to PP2 with the multimeter on the DC voltage setting. And these are just the test points, and they're all around the board to measure different aspects, whether it's the voltage going into these USB ports or the chip voltage, etc. So I had to use an online guide to find the appropriate test points in order to measure the voltage that the Raspberry Pi is receiving. And on the faulty power supply, the Raspberry Pi was receiving about 1.5 volts, I would say, around that ballpark, around 1.5 to 1.8 volts. And the phone charger was supplying, I'll say, close to 5 volts, maybe like around 4.2, I guess. And as you can see, there is a big difference between the two voltages, and that essentially led me to the conclusion that the power supply unit was faulty and that I had to simply replace it. And I do know that there are very few instances, but they do occur, that power supply units have stopped working, have failed to supply enough power to whatever the load is, whether it's a Raspberry Pi computer or even a radio, for example. So that is basically what has happened this week. It took me a few days to figure it out because I was surprised. I never ran into this issue before, but now I know one of the possible causes to why your Raspberry Pi may not be working. So be sure to actually look at the LEDs. Is the red LED turned on? Is it not? And is the green LED even flashing? Because these can really help indicate what the source of the problem is. So that's what I've learned this week, and thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.